My name is Margaret Calloway, and I want to tell you something about the moment I understood that the people who are supposed to love you the most are sometimes the ones who know exactly how to hurt you the deepest, because they know you well enough to know where you will not fight back. I stood in the marble hallway outside Probate Courtroom 4 in Charleston, South Carolina, holding a single photocopied page between two fingers like it might catch fire if I gripped it too tightly. On that page was my signature. My full legal name, Margaret Eleanor Calloway, written in the sloped, forward-leaning cursive I have used since the 7th grade, complete with the small looping tail on the final letter that I have never once changed in 22 years of writing my own name. Except I did not write it. I have spent 11 years of my professional life studying signatures the way other people study fingerprints. I am a certified forensic document examiner. Attorneys fly me into courtrooms across 3 states to sit in a witness box and explain, in language a jury can understand, why one signature is genuine and another is a lie pretending to be truth. I look at pen pressure. I look at the rhythm of a stroke, the tiny hesitations where a real hand pauses without thinking and a forger's hand pauses because they are concentrating too hard. I look at the angle of ascenders, the spacing between letters, the way ink pools at the beginning of a stroke and thins at the end. I have testified that a signature was forged when the difference was so small that opposing counsel needed a magnifying glass and 45 minutes of my testimony just to see what I was talking about. So when I tell you that I looked at that photocopied waiver on the day of my father's will reading and knew within 4 seconds that it was not my hand, I need you to understand that this was not a guess. This was not a grieving daughter looking for someone to blame. This was the one skill I had built an entire career on, turned suddenly and without warning on my own family, in the one place I never thought I would need to use it. But to understand how I ended up standing in that hallway, you need to go back 3 weeks, to a Tuesday afternoon in a funeral home that smelled like lilies and old carpet, where my father, Walter Calloway, was laid out in a casket he had actually picked out himself 2 years earlier, because that was the kind of man he was. Practical. Organized. The kind of man who built a furniture company from a single workshop behind our house into Calloway & Sons, 42 employees, 3 showrooms across the Lowcountry, and enough of a reputation that people still stopped my mother in the grocery store to tell her how a Calloway dining table had survived 4 kids, 2 hurricanes, and 1 particularly aggressive golden retriever. My father was 68 years old. He had beaten cancer once, quietly, without making a production of it, back when I was in graduate school studying document forensics at a program most people have never heard of. He beat it again 4 years later. The 3rd time, he did not beat it, and I flew home from a trial in Columbus, Ohio, still wearing the navy blazer I testify in, and I sat beside his hospital bed and held his hand while the machines did their slow, steady counting down, and I promised him I would take care of things. I did not know yet how much that promise would cost me. My older brother Derek was already at the funeral home when I arrived that Tuesday. Derek is 38, 4 years older than me, and he owns a bar and grill downtown called the Tide Table, the kind of place with exposed brick and a chalkboard drink menu that changes every Friday. Derek was always the golden one growing up, the one who could talk his way out of anything, the one our father used to call his right-hand man even though Derek had never worked a single day inside Calloway & Sons. I loved my brother. I want to say that clearly, at the very beginning of this, because everything that happened afterward did not erase 11 years of him teaching me to ride a bike in the church parking lot, or driving 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring me soup when I had the flu during my 2nd year of graduate school. I loved my brother. And that love is exactly what made what came next so difficult to see coming, and even harder to accept once I could not look away from it anymore. At the funeral, Derek hugged me so tightly I could feel him shaking. He kept saying he did not know how we were going to run the company without Dad. I told him we would figure it out together, the way we always had. I meant it. I want you to know I meant every word of that. 2 days after the funeral, Derek called me and asked if I would sign a few condolence cards for our father's longtime business associates, people who had sent flowers and needed a proper thank you note. He said he was drowning in paperwork and could not keep track of which cards needed which signature, mine or his or our mother's, and could I just come by the office and sign a stack quickly before I flew back to Ohio to finish testifying in the trial I had left mid-session. I did not think twice. Derek had always handled the administrative side of things when it came to family matters, ever since we were teenagers and our parents put him in charge of the checkbook for the church youth group trip because he was, in his words, better with people and paperwork than I was. I drove to the Callaway and Sons office on a Thursday afternoon, and Derek had a folder of papers waiting on the reception desk, already organized, already flagged with small yellow sticky notes marking exactly where I needed to sign. I remember him standing a little too close while I signed, refilling my coffee, asking about the trial in Ohio, keeping up a stream of easy conversation the way he always did. I remember thinking, even then, in some small unexamined corner of my mind, that he seemed nervous. I told myself it was grief. Grief makes people strange in ways you do not always recognize until much later, when you finally have the full picture and can look back and see every warning sign lined up in a row like something you should have caught the first time. I signed 6 cards that afternoon. I flew back to Columbus that evening and finished my testimony the following morning. I did not think about that folder again until the will reading, 3 weeks later, in a conference room at Roland Pierce's law office, the same office my father had used for 30 years, the same Roland Pierce who had been at every Callaway family Christmas party since before I was born, who my father called his oldest friend, who I had called Uncle Roland as a child even though we shared no blood at all. Roland read through the will slowly, the way lawyers do, pausing on every clause. My father had left the company in equal shares, 40% to Derek, 40% to me, and 20% held in trust for our mother, Eleanor, with the expectation that Derek and I would run the business together as co-presidents, exactly the way he had always talked about it at the dinner table, exactly the way he had told me himself in that hospital room in his last coherent week. I remember feeling, for just a moment, something close to peace. My father had trusted me. He had seen me as capable, as equal, as someone worthy of carrying his name forward into the next generation of the company. Then Roland cleared his throat and said there was an additional document that needed to be entered into the record. A waiver, signed by me, dated the Thursday after the funeral, renouncing my 40% stake in Callaway and Sons in favor of Derek assuming full ownership and sole presidency of the company. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud in that conference room, a short, disbelieving sound, because I thought it was a mistake, a clerical error, some other Margaret Callaway's paperwork accidentally filed under my father's estate. Roland slid the document across the table toward me. I picked it up. I saw my signature at the bottom of the page. My full name, my sloped forward cursive, my looping final letter. And I stopped laughing. I looked up at Derek. He would not meet my eyes. He was staring at a spot on the conference table like it held the answer to a question he did not want to ask himself. My mother sat between us, her hand pressed flat against her chest, looking from Derek to me and back again with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between confusion and dawning, unbearable understanding. I asked to see the original document, not the copy. Roland said the original was secured in the firm's files and could be produced upon formal request. I asked Derek, directly, whether he knew anything about this waiver. Derek said, in a voice so quiet I almost did not hear him, that I had signed it myself, that day in the office, along with the condolence cards. That I had known exactly what I was signing. I want to tell you that I screamed. I want to tell you I stood up and overturned that conference table and told Roland Pierce exactly what I thought of him and his firm and 30 years of false friendship. But that is not what happened, because 11 years of testifying in courtrooms had taught me something my brother had apparently forgotten about me entirely. It had taught me to be still. It had taught me that the worst thing you can do when you discover a fraud is to react before you have secured your evidence, because the moment you tip your hand, the people who committed that fraud start covering their tracks, and every hour you spend being emotional is an hour they spend making sure you can never prove what you already know to be true. So I did not scream. I asked, very calmly, for a copy of the waiver to take with me. Roland hesitated, glanced at Derek, and then had his assistant make the copy. I folded it, put it in my bag, thanked everyone for their time, and drove home. I sat in my car in my own driveway for 11 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I looked at that signature 4 more times. I looked at the pressure points where a real signature naturally thickens and thins as the hand moves at its own unconscious rhythm. I looked at the connection between the E and the L in Eleanor, a connection I make in a very specific, almost lazy way that no forger, not even a good one, tends to replicate perfectly, because forgers copy the shape of a signature, but they cannot copy the muscle memory behind it. And there, in the connection between those two letters, I found it. A hesitation. A tiny, almost invisible pause where a real signature would have flowed without thought. Someone had traced my name, or copied it freehand from another document, close enough to fool a grieving mother and a courtroom that was not looking closely, but not close enough to fool the one person in that conference room who had spent her entire career learning exactly what to look for. That night, I did not cry, though I want to be honest with you and tell you that I wanted to. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and I started writing down every date, every detail, every moment I could remember from that Thursday afternoon in the Callaway and Sons office, while the memory was still fresh enough to be useful. I wrote down that Derek had prepared the folder in advance. I wrote down that he had stood close enough to see exactly what I was signing but had never once shown me the actual condolence cards, only sticky notes marking signature lines. I wrote down that Roland Pierce had produced this waiver at the will reading instead of simply handling it as part of the estate distribution, which meant he had wanted witnesses in the room when it surfaced, my mother specifically, because a shocked, grieving widow was far less likely to challenge a document that made her surviving children look united rather than divided. I did not know yet, that first night, how deep this went. I did not know that Derek's gambling debts had reached a number so large that a man who once brought me soup during a snowstorm had convinced himself he had no other choice. I did not know that Roland Pierce had been quietly moving money out of Callaway and Sons for the better part of a decade, long before my father ever got sick the first time, and that this waiver was never really about Derek wanting the company at all. It was about making absolutely certain that the one person with the training to look closely at those books, the one person who had actually helped digitize the company's financial records 18 months earlier and still had time-stamped, notarized copies sitting quietly in a personal cloud archive that neither of them knew existed, never got close enough to see what was really missing. All I knew, that first night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a legal pad covered in handwriting analysis notes about my own name, was that my brother had let me believe I was signing sympathy cards while he watched me sign away everything my father had spent 40 years building. And somewhere underneath the shock, underneath the grief that had not even had a chance to finish arriving before it was interrupted by betrayal, something else was starting to take shape inside me. Something quieter than anger. Something closer to resolve. Because I had spent 11 years of my life proving, in courtroom after courtroom, that the truth leaves marks even when someone tries very hard to erase it. I had spent 11 years teaching juries how to see what a forger hoped they would never notice. And now, for the first time in my career, I was going to have to use every single thing I had ever learned, not for a stranger's case, not for a client I would never see again after the trial ended, but for myself, for my father's memory, and for a company that carried our family name on every single piece of furniture it had ever built. I picked up the copy of the waiver one more time before I finally went to bed that night. I looked at my own name, forged onto a document I had never truly agreed to, and I said, out loud, to an empty kitchen, that I had built an entire career on knowing the difference between what was real and what was fake, and that whoever had done this had made the mistake of forging the signature of the one person in Charleston, South Carolina, who would absolutely, without question, be able to prove it. I did not know yet that the road ahead would cost me my access to my father's company, the trust of an aunt who would call me difficult for daring to ask questions 2 weeks after burying her own brother, and, for a while, the relationship I had with my own mother, who was so exhausted by grief that peace felt safer to her than truth. I did not know yet that rock bottom was still ahead of me, waiting patiently, the way it always does, right before things finally start to turn. But that night, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a photocopy and a resolve I did not fully understand the size of yet, I made myself a promise. My father built something real. my name was real. And I was going to spend whatever it took proving both of those things, to Derek, to Roland Pierce, and to a courtroom that was about to learn exactly what happens when you forge the signature of a woman who has spent her entire career learning how to catch a lie. The morning after I found that hesitation in my own forged signature, I woke up early and drove straight to the Callaway and Sons offices on Meeting Street, the same building where I had spent childhood summers doing homework in the back office while my father walked the showroom floor, greeting customers by name, running his hand along the edge of a cherrywood table like he was checking on an old friend. I still had my key card from years of helping with company events. I badged into the side entrance, walked up the same staircase I had climbed 1,000 times, and found that my card no longer worked on the door to the executive offices. I stood there for a long moment, pressing the card against the reader again and again, watching the small red light blink its refusal, and I understood before anyone said a single word to me that this had already been decided. Someone had made a phone call. Someone had removed my access before I had even finished my coffee that morning. Derek came out from the executive hallway a few minutes later, dressed in one of our father's old suit jackets, which fit him slightly wrong through the shoulders in a way that made my chest ache before I could stop it. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had not slept, and some small, stubborn part of me wanted to ask him if he was okay, the way I had asked him 1,000 times over 38 years of being his little sister. I did not ask. I had learned, in the space of one night, to be careful with the parts of myself that still wanted to trust him. I asked him, calmly, why my key card had been deactivated. He told me that with the waiver in place, company counsel had advised that access to sensitive financial systems should be restricted to current shareholders and officers only, and that until the estate matter was fully resolved, it made sense for things to stay simple. Simple was the word he used. I remember it precisely because it was such a small, bloodless word for something that felt like having a door closed in my face by my own brother, in the building our father built, using our father's name. I told him the waiver was forged. I said it plainly, without raising my voice, standing in that hallway that smelled like the same cedar polish it had smelled like since I was a child. Derek's face did something complicated, a flicker of what I now understand was guilt trying to disguise itself as offense, and he said I was grieving and confused and that accusing him of forgery, of all things, was exactly the kind of thing that could tear this family apart at the worst possible time. He said our mother had been through enough. He said I needed to let this go, for her sake if not for his. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, because I certainly had to. Let this go. As though proving that someone had stolen my inheritance through fraud was an act of selfishness rather than an act of simple, factual truth. As though grief gave a person license to steal, and grief gave the person being stolen from an obligation to stay quiet about it. I left the building that day without my father's company, without access to the accounts, without so much as a desk to sit at. I drove to my mother's house instead, thinking, foolishly, that she would be the one person who would look at that signature the way I had, who would see what I saw and stand beside me the way she had stood beside me my entire life. My mother, Eleanor Callaway, opened the door already looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour of the morning. She had lost 15 pounds since the funeral. Her hand shook slightly when she poured our tea, a tremor I do not think she was even aware of anymore. I laid the copy of the waiver on her kitchen table, the same table where I had done my homework as a child, and I walked her through everything, the hesitation in the letter connection, the pressure inconsistencies, the folder Derek had prepared with sticky notes marking exactly where to sign without ever letting me see what I was actually signing. My mother looked at that document for a long time. Longer than I expected. And when she finally looked up at me, her eyes were wet, but what she said was not what I had hoped to hear. She said that Derek would never do something like that. She said he had always struggled more than I had, that he had always needed more help than I did, that maybe, in the chaos and grief of that week, I had simply signed something without reading it closely enough and now I was looking for someone to blame because blaming Derek felt easier than admitting I had made a mistake. I felt something crack open in my chest, quiet and total, like a support beam giving way somewhere deep inside a house that still looked fine from the outside. I asked her, very carefully, whether she was saying she believed I had signed away my inheritance and simply forgotten. She did not answer that question directly. She said, instead, that she could not lose both her children to a fight over money 2 weeks after burying her husband, and that she needed peace in this family more than she needed to know exactly what had happened in that office on that Thursday afternoon. I understood, in that moment, sitting at my childhood kitchen table with tea going cold in front of me, that my mother had made a choice, and the choice was not between believing me and believing Derek. The choice was between confronting a painful, complicated truth and accepting a comfortable, simple lie, and grief had made the comfortable lie feel like the only thing keeping her upright. I did not hate her for it. I want to be honest about that. I understood it, even as it broke something inside me that would take a very long time to fully repair. It was my Aunt Patricia, my father's younger sister, who said the word that finally settled somewhere permanent inside me. I called her 3 days later, hoping that as my father's blood relative, as someone who had known Derek and me our entire lives, she might see this more clearly than my mother could. Instead, Patricia sighed into the phone in a way that made it clear she had already had this conversation with someone else, probably Derek, and told me that fighting over money right after my father's death made me look difficult. That word. Difficult. As though a forensic document examiner pointing out a forgery in a legal document was an act of family disloyalty rather than the exact skill set I had spent 11 years building specifically to protect people from this kind of fraud. I stopped calling family members after that conversation with Patricia. Not out of spite, but out of a kind of clear-eyed exhaustion, the recognition that every phone call was costing me energy I needed for something more useful than trying to convince people who had already decided what was easier to believe. The company moved faster than I expected. Within the week, Derek was formally installed as sole president of Callaway & Sons at a small, quiet ceremony I was not invited to, though I heard about it from a former employee who still had my cell number and thought I deserved to know. My name was removed from the company letterhead. My email account, the one I had used for 11 years to correspond with vendors and clients on behalf of the family business, even though I had never technically drawn a salary from it, was deactivated without warning, midway through what I later learned was an unfinished thread with a supplier my father had trusted for 20 years. I lost my father's company. I lost, for a time, my mother's belief in me. I lost the easy comfort of an aunt who had known me since I was born, replaced now with a coolness in her voice every time my name came up at a family gathering I was no longer invited to. I sat in my own home, in the evenings, in a silence so complete it had a texture to it, and I asked myself honestly whether Derek and Patricia and even my own mother might be right. Whether grief had done something to my memory that I could not fully account for. Whether I had, somehow, in some moment I could not recall, actually agreed to give away everything my father had built. But then I would look at that photocopied signature again, laid flat under the small desk lamp in my home office, and I would trace the connection between the E and the L in Eleanor with the tip of my finger, feeling for the hesitation I knew was there because I had spent 11 years training my eyes to find exactly this kind of small, damning truth. And every single time, without fail, the doubt would fall away, because the evidence did not care whether my family believed me. The evidence simply was what it was. It was on the 11th night of that particular kind of loneliness, the kind where your own family has quietly decided you are the problem, that I stopped sitting in my dark living room feeling sorry for myself and instead sat down at my desk with a legal pad, a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, and the full, focused attention I usually reserved for a client's case file. I thought about every certified signature sample I had on file with the state licensing board, 9 years of documented, dated, notarized proof of exactly what my handwriting looked like under a dozen different conditions. I thought about the 18 months I had spent helping my father digitize the company's estate and shareholder records, back when he first got sick the second time and wanted everything organized in case something happened to him, and how I had quietly kept a personal backup of everything in my own cloud archive, time-stamped and complete, purely out of professional habit, never imagining I would one day need it to defend myself against my own brother. I picked up my phone that night and called a former colleague from graduate school who now worked in forensic accounting, and I asked her, carefully, hypothetically, what it would take to trace irregularities in a family business's financial records going back several years. She asked me, gently, if everything was okay. I told her not yet, but it was going to be. I want you to understand something about the woman I was on that 11th night, sitting alone at my desk with a legal pad covered in handwriting notes and a phone call to a forensic accountant still warm in my memory. I was not the same woman who had laughed in disbelief in that conference room 3 weeks earlier. Grief had tried to make me small and quiet and doubtful of my own trained eye. My family had tried to make me believe that asking questions was the same thing as causing harm. And for 11 days, I had let that grief and that doubt sit heavy on my chest, because losing your father and your brother and your mother's belief in you, all in the same month, is the kind of loss that has a right to knock you down for a while. But I come from a man who built a furniture company out of a single workshop with his own 2 hands, who never once let a setback convince him to stop building. And somewhere in the quiet of that 11th night, I understood that I was done sitting still. I was done absorbing accusations of being difficult. I was done letting people who had not spent a single day of their lives studying signatures tell me what my own trained eyes had clearly, unmistakably seen. I closed my legal pad that night, turned off my desk lamp, and for the first time since the will reading, I slept without waking up at 3 in the morning replaying that conference room over and over in my mind. Because I finally understood that I did not need my mother's belief or my aunt's approval or Derek's permission to fight for the truth. I had something better than belief. I had proof, sitting quietly in a cloud archive that neither Derek nor Roland Pierce even knew existed, and I was about to spend every bit of skill I had built over 11 years making absolutely certain that proof saw the inside of a courtroom. I want to tell you about the morning I finally stopped waiting for my family to believe me and started building a case that did not require anyone's belief at all, because the truth, when properly documented, does not need permission to exist. The forensic accountant I had called 11 nights earlier, my old graduate school colleague, a sharp and careful woman named Priya Nagesh, met me for coffee 2 days later at a small shop far enough from downtown Charleston that I did not have to worry about running into anyone who knew my family. I laid out everything I had. The photocopied waiver. My 9 years of certified signature samples filed with the state licensing board. The cloud archive of digitized estate documents I had quietly kept a personal backup of 18 months earlier, back when my father first asked me to help him organize everything in case his illness returned. Priya went quiet for a long moment after I finished talking, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table, and then she said something that has stayed with me every day since. She said that in her experience, family financial fraud almost never happens in isolation. If someone was willing to forge a signature to take control of a company, it was worth asking what else that control was meant to protect. I had not thought of it that way before. I had been so focused on proving what had been done to me that I had not yet asked myself the harder question, which was why anyone would go to such lengths to make sure Derek, and only Derek, controlled Callaway and Sons. That question sat with me for the rest of that week, quiet and persistent, the way the most important questions always do. I knew I could not build this case alone. Proving a forgery in a courtroom is a different discipline than simply identifying one in my own office, and I needed someone who understood estate law, someone who could take my technical findings and translate them into the kind of formal legal action that could actually restore what had been taken from me. I asked around, carefully, discreetly, and 3 separate people, a former client, a judge I had testified in front of years earlier, and Priya herself, all mentioned the same name. Thomas Whitfield. I found Thomas Whitfield's office on a quiet side street off King Street, a converted historic building with his name in simple gold lettering on the door, no flash, no grandeur, nothing that suggested a man trying to impress anyone. I called ahead and was given an appointment for that Thursday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks to the day since Derek had handed me a folder of what I believed were condolence cards. Thomas Whitfield was not what I expected. I do not know exactly what I had pictured, some slick, aggressive litigator with a corner office and a wall of framed newspaper clippings about himself, but the man who stood up from behind a desk covered in neatly organized case files was tall and unhurried, with reading glasses pushed up into dark hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that studied me with an attentiveness I was not used to receiving from strangers. He had my file open in front of him before I even sat down, which told me he had actually read every page I had sent ahead, not skimmed it the way I had come to expect from people too busy to take my situation seriously. I explained everything again: the waiver, the hesitation in the letter connection, the pressure inconsistencies, the folder of sticky notes, the deactivated key card, my mother's exhausted refusal to look closely at what was right in front of her. Thomas listened without interrupting me once, which I noticed and appreciated more than I expected to, because so many people in my life over the past 3 weeks had been eager to interrupt me with their own theories about what I must have misunderstood. When I finished, he picked up the photocopied waiver and studied it himself for a long moment, not pretending to have my expertise, but genuinely looking, genuinely trying to see what I saw. Then he set it down and said something that made the tight knot in my chest loosen for the first time in 3 weeks. He said that in his professional opinion, based on everything I had just laid out, I did not sound like a woman who was confused or grieving into false memory. I sounded like a woman who had correctly identified a fraud and had spent 3 weeks being gaslit by people who found the truth inconvenient. I felt my eyes sting, and I hated that they did, because I had promised myself I would not cry in front of a stranger, not even a stranger who had just said the single kindest, most validating sentence anyone had said to me since my father died. Thomas noticed, and to his credit, he did not make a show of it. He simply slid a box of tissues an inch closer to me and kept talking, giving me a moment to collect myself without drawing attention to the fact that I needed one. He told me that we had 2 paths forward. We could quietly negotiate with Roland Pierce and Derek's counsel, presenting my evidence and requesting the waiver be voided without a formal court battle, which would be faster but relied entirely on their willingness to admit wrongdoing without a fight. Or we could file a formal petition to contest the waiver, subpoena the original physical document instead of the photocopy, and build a complete evidentiary case designed to hold up not just against a quiet negotiation but against a full courtroom challenge if it came to that. He recommended the second path, and when I asked him why, he said something I have thought about many times since. He said that men who are willing to forge a signature once are rarely willing to admit it quietly the first time you ask them to. He said if I wanted my inheritance back and the truth fully acknowledged, I needed to be prepared to make it very difficult for them to keep lying. I agreed. And in that moment, sitting across from Thomas Whitfield in an office that smelled faintly of old paper and cedar, I felt something shift inside me, the same kind of shift I imagine my father must have felt the day he decided to build his first workshop instead of continuing to work for someone else's furniture company. I was done being the person things happened to. Over the following 2 weeks, Thomas and I worked closely together, and I want to tell you honestly that something in those late afternoon meetings, poring over documents and building timelines, began to feel less like a business relationship and more like something I had not expected to find in the middle of the worst season of my life. Thomas asked me real questions, not just about the case, but about my father, about the company, about what it had felt like to grow up watching a man build something out of nothing with his own hands. He remembered small details I mentioned once and brought them up again days later, which told me he was actually listening, not simply managing a client. I found myself looking forward to our meetings in a way that had nothing to do with legal strategy, and staying a few minutes longer than necessary each time, telling myself it was because there was always one more detail to review. I filed a formal petition to contest the waiver on a bright Tuesday morning, Thomas standing beside me at the clerk's window, and I subpoenaed the original physical document from Roland Pierce's office, forcing him to produce the real waiver instead of the digital copy he had shown at the will reading. I subpoenaed my own certified signature file from the state licensing board, 9 years of documented proof of exactly what my genuine signature looked like under a dozen different conditions. And quietly, carefully, I began working with Priya to trace the financial irregularities she had asked me about over coffee, starting with the vendor account I remembered flagging as unusual during those 18 months of digitizing the company's books, an account that seemed to move money in patterns that made no sense for a furniture company's actual operating needs. Derek found out I had filed the petition within days, and he called me himself, his voice tight with something that sounded less like anger and more like fear, though I did not understand yet why fear would be his reaction rather than simple frustration at being challenged. He asked me to drop it. He said I did not understand what I was getting into, that some things were more complicated than I realized, that pushing this forward could hurt people I did not intend to hurt. I asked him directly what he meant by that, and he went quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment before saying, simply, that I would understand eventually, and that he hoped when I did, I would forgive him. I did not know it yet, but that phone call was the first crack in the story I thought I understood. I thought this was simply about greed, about a brother deciding he wanted the company more than he wanted to share it fairly with his sister. I did not yet know about the gambling debts, or about Roland Pierce's decade of quiet theft, or about the fear that had made my brother desperate enough to do something he never would have done on his own. I only knew that something in his voice that day did not sound like a man protecting his own interests. It sounded like a man protecting a secret he was terrified of, and terrified for me to find. I told Thomas about the call that same evening, sitting across from him at a small table in a quiet restaurant near his office, a meeting that had started as case strategy and had somehow, without either of us quite naming it, turned into dinner. He listened carefully, the way he always did, and then he said that in his experience, when a person facing accountability starts warning you away instead of simply denying wrongdoing, it usually meant there was more beneath the surface than either of us had yet uncovered. He reached across the table then, briefly, and covered my hand with his, not in a way that felt like overstepping, but in a way that felt like someone steadying me for whatever was still ahead. I let him. For the first time in 3 weeks, I let myself feel something other than grief and fury and exhausted determination. I drove home that night with the windows down, the warm Charleston air moving through the car, and I thought about my father, about the promise I had made him in that hospital room to take care of things. I had spent 3 weeks believing that taking care of things meant proving I had been wronged. But sitting in Thomas Whitfield's office that afternoon, watching him build a legal strategy around my evidence with the same careful precision I brought to every signature I had ever examined, I understood that taking care of things meant something larger than simply winning back what had been stolen from me. It meant uncovering exactly what Derek had been so afraid I would find, and being brave enough to look at it directly, even if the truth turned out to be far more complicated, and far sadder, than a simple story of a greedy brother stealing his sister's inheritance. I did not know yet how right I was to sense that something larger was waiting beneath the surface of that vendor account Priya was quietly tracing. I only knew that for the first time since the will reading, I was not standing still, waiting for someone else to decide what happened to me next. I was moving forward, evidence in hand, a steady and unexpected ally beside me, toward whatever truth was still buried in those books. Priya called me on a Wednesday morning, her voice tighter than I had ever heard it, and asked me to come to her office immediately, that she had found something in the vendor account records that I needed to see with my own eyes rather than hear over the phone. I drove across town with my hands gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, my mind running through every possibility, none of which prepared me for what she actually laid out on her desk. The vendor account I had flagged 18 months earlier during the digitization project, the one that seemed to move money in patterns that made no sense for a furniture company's operating needs, did not begin during Derek's brief and troubled tenure as president. It began 10 years earlier, during the exact period when my father was undergoing his first round of cancer treatment, back when he had quietly stepped back from day-to-day financial oversight and trusted the details to the one person who had managed every dollar of Callaway and Sons for 3 decades. Roland Pierce. Priya spread the printed records across the desk in front of me, month after month, year after year, small, careful withdrawals routed through a vendor account for a supplier that, according to every shipping record and inventory log she could find, had never actually delivered a single piece of lumber, fabric, or hardware to the company. The vendor did not exist in any meaningful operational sense. It existed on paper only, a hollow shell built to justify money quietly leaving Callaway and Sons and landing, through a chain of transfers Priya was still tracing, somewhere Roland Pierce could access without ever putting his own name directly on a single transaction. I sat very still in that chair, staring at 10 years of my father's trust being systematically hollowed out by the man he called his oldest friend, and I felt something inside me reorganize itself completely. This had never been about Derek wanting the company for himself. Derek did not have the patience or the financial sophistication to build something this careful, this sustained, this quietly ruinous. This belonged to Roland Pierce, and it had been happening for a decade, through my father's illness, through his recovery, through the years he believed his company was thriving under the careful oversight of a man he trusted completely. I called Thomas the moment I left Priya's office, and he met me within the hour, and together we sat with the timeline until it finally arranged itself into something we could both see clearly. Roland Pierce had been embezzling from Callaway and Sons since long before my father's death, since before his illness even returned the final time. And when my father finally passed, Roland had a serious problem, because the company's finances were about to pass into new hands, mine and Derek's together, exactly the way my father had always intended. And I was not simply an heir. I was a forensic document examiner with the exact professional training required to look closely at financial irregularities and recognize a fraud the moment I saw one. Roland could not risk me having equal oversight of those books. So he needed a reason to keep me out entirely, and he needed someone inside the family willing to help him do it. That was where Derek came in, and this is the part of the story that I still, even now, find difficult to hold without feeling something complicated and sad settle into my chest alongside the anger. Thomas's private investigator, a quiet, thorough man named Frank Delgado who Thomas brought in once we suspected there was more beneath the surface, spent 4 days looking into Derek's finances and came back with an answer that reframed everything. Derek was $340,000 in debt to an underground sports betting operation that had, in recent months, begun making threats against the tide table, threats serious enough that Derek had started sleeping with a baseball bat beside his bed. Roland Pierce had known about this debt for months, likely because Roland moved in circles where that kind of information traveled quietly among men who used desperation as currency. And Roland had offered Derek a way out. He would personally forgive a substantial loan he claimed to have quietly extended to cover part of Derek's debt, and in exchange, Derek would help make sure the company stayed fully under Derek's sole control rather than shared oversight with me, using whatever means necessary. But Roland had not told Derek the truth about why he needed that control. Roland had told Derek a different story entirely, a story designed specifically to make a frightened, desperate man believe he was protecting our family rather than betraying it. Roland told Derek that our father's company was already quietly, catastrophically in debt because of Walter's own poor decisions during his illness, a lie built on nothing, and that if the full financial picture became public through a shared ownership structure, it would destroy our father's reputation and leave our mother with nothing but a company drowning in bad press and legal liability. Roland told Derek that keeping me at arm's length from the books, at least temporarily, was the only way to quietly restructure the finances and protect Eleanor from watching her husband's legacy collapse in front of her. Derek believed him. My brother, drowning in fear for his own life and manipulated by a man he had known since childhood, a man our father trusted completely, believed he was protecting our mother and our father's memory. He believed forging that waiver was the lesser of two terrible choices, a temporary, contained betrayal meant to buy time to quietly fix a crisis that, in reality, existed only in Roland Pierce's careful, self-serving lie. I sat across from Thomas in his office that evening, the full timeline spread across the table between us, and I felt the anger I had been carrying for weeks shift into something more complicated, something that had room for both fury at what had been done to me and a strange, aching grief for what had been done to my brother. Derek had not set out to steal from me because he wanted more than his share. Derek had been cornered by fear and manipulated by a man decades more experienced at manipulation than he could have anticipated, and in that cornering, he had made a choice that hurt me badly, a choice I was not yet ready to forgive, but a choice I could finally, for the first time, understand. Thomas watched me process all of this without rushing me, without filling the silence with his own opinions before I had worked out my own. When I finally spoke, my voice came out steadier than I expected, and I told him that this changed our strategy but it did not change what needed to happen. Roland Pierce needed to be fully exposed, in both the forgery and the embezzlement. Derek needed to face real consequences for what he had done to me, but I no longer wanted this to end with my brother destroyed alongside a man who had spent a decade calculating exactly how to use him. Thomas nodded slowly, and then he said something that has stayed with me since. He said that in 18 years of practicing estate and fraud law, He had rarely seen a client respond to betrayal with this much clarity about who actually deserved her fury and who deserved something closer to mercy. He said it was one of the most quietly remarkable things he had ever watched someone do. I did not know what to say to that. I felt my face warm in a way that had nothing to do with the office lighting, and when I looked up, Thomas was watching me with an expression I recognized, because I had spent 11 years learning to read the smallest details in a person's face and hand, and what I saw in his was not simply professional respect. It was something warmer, something that had been building quietly across the weeks we had spent working side by side, late evenings over case files, dinners that started as strategy sessions and ended as something else entirely. He asked me, carefully, if it was inappropriate for him to say that watching me handle this had been one of the more extraordinary things he had witnessed in his career, and that somewhere in the middle of building this case together, he had started looking forward to seeing me walk through his office door for reasons that had very little to do with legal strategy. I felt something in my chest loosen, something that had been held tight and guarded since the day I found that forged signature, and I told him, honestly, that I had been feeling exactly the same thing and had simply been too focused on surviving my own family's betrayal to let myself acknowledge it. He reached across the table and took my hand, not the brief, steadying touch from that restaurant weeks earlier, but something more deliberate, more certain. He said he did not want to rush anything, that he understood I was in the middle of the hardest season of my life, but that he wanted me to know, clearly and honestly, that whatever happened with the case, he hoped I would let him stay close to me once it was over. I told him I would like that very much, and for a long moment, we simply sat there together in his quiet office, the weight of everything we had uncovered still spread across the table between us, and underneath all of it, something new and warm and entirely unexpected had quietly taken root. But there was still work to be done, and I was not a woman who let her heart distract her from finishing what she started. I told Thomas that we needed to move quickly now that we understood the full picture, because Roland Pierce did not yet know that we had traced the vendor account back a full decade, and every day we waited was another day he had to notice the subpoenas closing in and start covering his tracks even further. Thomas agreed, and together we began building the final piece of our case, a plan to bring Derek and Roland into the same room, to lay out everything we now understood in front of both of them at once, and to finally force the confrontation that would determine not just the future of Calloway and Sons, but the future of my relationship with the brother who had betrayed me and the man he had allowed to manipulate him into doing it. I left Thomas's office that night into warm Charleston air, the kind that smells like salt and jasmine even in the middle of a crisis, and for the first time since the will reading, I did not feel entirely alone in what was still ahead of me. I had evidence. I had Priya's careful accounting. I had Thomas beside me, in every sense of the word now, steady and certain in a way I had not expected to find in the middle of losing so much else. And I had, finally, a full and complete understanding of exactly what had happened to my family, and exactly what I needed to do next to make it right. Thomas and I scheduled the deposition for a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Priya first spread those vendor account records across her desk. We chose his office rather than a courtroom, deliberately, because Thomas believed, and I agreed, that Roland Pierce would be far more likely to unravel in a familiar, quiet setting than in the formal theater of a courtroom, where a man like Roland had spent 30 years learning exactly how to perform composure. Derek arrived first, alone, wearing a suit that looked like it no longer fit him properly, though I understood now that the ill fit had nothing to do with his shoulders and everything to do with the weight he had been carrying silently for months. He sat across the conference table from me, and for the first time since the will reading, he actually looked at me directly instead of finding some safer spot on the table to study. I did not open with anger, though I had every right to. I opened by sliding a folder across the table toward him, the same careful, methodical way I open every case I have ever presented in a courtroom, and I walked him through the timeline Priya had built. The vendor account that began 10 years earlier. The withdrawals that predated his own gambling debts by years. The pattern that made it unmistakably clear that Roland Pierce had been stealing from our father long before Derek ever needed a way out of anything. I watched my brother's face change as he understood, piece by piece, that the story Roland had told him, the story about our father's failing finances and a company already drowning before Derek ever forged a single signature, had been a lie built specifically to manipulate a frightened, desperate man into protecting a decade of someone else's theft. Derek's hands began to shake. He asked me, in a voice that had lost every trace of the defensive edge he had carried since the will reading, whether I was certain. I told him I was, and I slid the printed bank records toward him so he could see it with his own eyes, the way I had needed to see it with mine. Derek put his head in his hands and did not speak for a long moment, and when he finally did, what came out of him was not an excuse. It was an unraveling. He told me about the debt, the threats against the tide table, the nights he slept with a bat beside his bed because men had started showing up at the restaurant asking pointed questions about payment. He told me Roland had approached him quietly, almost gently, framing the waiver not as theft but as protection, protection for our mother, protection for our father's legacy, protection for a family Roland claimed was one bad audit away from public collapse. He told me he believed, genuinely believed, that forging my signature was the only way to buy enough time to fix things quietly before I ever had to know how bad it supposedly was. I did not forgive him in that moment. I want to be honest about that, because I think honesty matters more than a tidy ending. But I told him, clearly, that I finally understood the difference between what he had done and what Roland Pierce had done, and that understanding was not the same as forgiveness, but it was the necessary first step toward it. Roland arrived 20 minutes later, unaware that Derek had already told me everything, and I watched him walk into that conference room with the same easy, practiced confidence he had carried into every Calloway family gathering for 30 years. He sat down across from Thomas and me, glanced at Derek's pale, shaken face, and I saw something flicker behind his eyes, a small recalibration, though he did not yet know how much ground had already shifted beneath him. Thomas opened the deposition formally, and I let him lay the early groundwork, the waiver, the forged signature, the pressure inconsistencies I had documented in exhaustive detail. Roland answered every question with smooth, practiced deflection, suggesting grief had clouded my memory, suggesting Derek and I should resolve this privately as a family rather than through formal legal channels. He was good at this. 30 years of legal experience had taught him exactly how to sound reasonable while saying nothing true. Then I laid the vendor account records on the table. I watched Roland Pierce's composure crack for the first time in 30 years of knowing him. He tried, for a moment, to spin it, suggesting the vendor account represented a legitimate business relationship Priya had simply misunderstood, but Thomas was ready for exactly this, and he produced the final piece of evidence Priya had uncovered 2 nights earlier, buried in an old server backup Roland had clearly forgotten still existed. An email, sent by Roland to himself a decade earlier, outlining in his own words a plan to route company funds through a shell vendor account during Walter's illness, when financial oversight would be at its weakest and least likely to be questioned. Roland stared at that email for a long time. I watched 30 years of practiced composure finally give way to something smaller, more human, more afraid, and when he finally spoke, it was not a defense. It was a request, quiet and almost pleading, that we consider what exposing this fully would do to his reputation, his family, everything he had built. I thought about my father, lying in that hospital bed, trusting this man completely with everything he had spent 40 years building. I thought about my mother, sitting in her kitchen believing I had simply forgotten what I signed rather than accept that a man she had called family for 3 decades had orchestrated all of it. I looked at Roland Pierce and told him, calmly, that he should have thought about what exposure would cost him before he spent a decade stealing from a man who called him his oldest friend. The consequences that followed were swift and thorough. Roland was reported to the state bar and stripped of his license within 2 months, and criminal embezzlement charges followed shortly after, charges that would eventually result in restitution and a sentence that, while I will not pretend brought me pure satisfaction, brought something quieter and more important, which was simply the truth finally being acknowledged by every institution that mattered. Derek's path looked different, because I made a choice, deliberately, at the first formal hearing, to decline pressing criminal forgery charges against my own brother. I offered instead a full settlement requiring complete financial transparency, restoration of my shares in Calloway & Sons, and Derek's formal acknowledgement, on record, of exactly what had happened and why. Derek accepted without hesitation, relief written across his face in a way I had not seen since we were children. He began repaying what he could toward the company's restructuring, and he started attending counseling for the gambling that had made him vulnerable enough for a man like Roland Pierce to exploit in the first place. I did not erase what he did to me. But I gave him room to become someone who might, eventually, deserve to be my brother again, and in the months that followed, I watched him slowly start to earn that back, one honest conversation at a time. My mother's reckoning was its own kind of difficult. When the full truth finally reached her, not the simplified, comfortable version she had clung to out of grief and exhaustion, but the entire decade-long picture, she broke down completely in my kitchen, the same kitchen where she had once told me to let this go for the sake of peace. She apologized in a way I do not think she had ever apologized to anyone in her life, fully, without deflection, without asking me to make it easier for her. I held her while she cried, and something between us, something that had cracked on the day she chose comfortable doubt over difficult truth, slowly, carefully, began to mend. Callaway & Sons was restructured in the months that followed, with new financial oversight built directly into its governance, and I took a formal seat on the board, not as a silent shareholder, but as the person specifically responsible for auditing the very kind of irregularity that had nearly destroyed everything my father built. It felt, finally, like honoring what he actually wanted, not the fractured, forged version of his wishes Roland had manufactured, but the real one, the one he told me himself in that hospital room. Equal. Trusted. Capable. And then there was Thomas. I want to tell you about the evening, several weeks after Roland's case had moved fully into the hands of the state prosecutors, when Thomas asked me to meet him at his office after hours, saying he had something he wanted to give me. I expected paperwork, some final piece of the case wrapping up loose ends. Instead, I found him standing beside his desk with a framed document in his hands, and when he turned it toward me, I saw my father's original will, the real one, the one Walter Callaway had signed and had properly witnessed and notarized years before his death, carefully preserved and framed under glass. Thomas told me he had it made specially, not as evidence, not as a legal document anymore, but as something else entirely. He said he wanted me to have proof of something that had never actually been in question, not for one single moment, which was that I was exactly who I said I was, that my name was real, that my signature was real, that everything I had fought for over these past months had simply been the truth waiting patiently to be acknowledged. He said watching me fight for that truth, methodically, patiently, without ever losing the essential kindness underneath my fury, had been the thing that made him fall in love with me, somewhere between the late-night document reviews and the dinners that stopped pretending to be strategy sessions. I let myself cry then, finally, fully, not from grief, but from something warmer and more complete than I had felt in months. I told him I loved him too, that somewhere in the middle of losing so much, I had found something I had not even known I was looking for, someone who saw my precision and my patience not as coldness but as the very thing worth loving about me. We stood together in his quiet office, my father's real will framed between us, and I understood that this was not a generic ending, not a romance built on convenient timing. This was two people who had spent months in the trenches of the hardest thing either of us had faced, who had earned every quiet moment of trust between us the slow, deliberate way, through late nights and honest conversations and a shared refusal to let injustice stand unanswered. If this story moved you even half as much as living through it moved me, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to this channel and stay close for whatever comes next, because there are more stories like mine waiting to be told, stories about the quiet, determined ways people fight their way back to the truth, and I promise you, every single one of them is worth staying for. I still work as a forensic document examiner. I still sit in courtrooms proving what is real and what is fake, though these days I carry a different kind of certainty with me, one that has nothing to do with signatures and everything to do with knowing, finally, exactly who stands beside me. My father's company carries his real name now, his real wishes, honored the way he always intended. My brother is still rebuilding what he broke, one honest day at a time, and I let him, because grace, given carefully and deliberately, is its own kind of strength. And sometimes, late in the evening, when Thomas and I sit together reviewing some new case file at his kitchen table, I think about that hallway outside probate courtroom 4, about the woman I was standing there holding a forged signature with shaking hands, certain of nothing except what her own trained eyes could prove. I think about how far that woman walked, from doubt to certainty, from isolation to a family slowly, imperfectly healing, from a stolen inheritance to a company restored and a love she never saw coming. I used to think my job was proving what is fake. I have learned, since then, that the harder job, the one that actually saved my family, was proving what was real all along. And I am just getting started.